The wind howled low through Arlington National Cemetery, cutting sharp across the chapel's warped wooden walls, where silence hung like a shroud too heavy to lift, broken only by the soft creak of old pews and the ragged, choked sobs echoing through the gloom. The air reeked of wilting white lilies, their drooping petals tangled with the crushing load of grief. They'd gathered to send off a hero, but the word rang hollow now, a bitter sting in the throat. Down the center of the aisle, beneath cracked stained glass windows spilling a pale, lifeless morning glow, sat a weathered oak casket. A neatly folded flag lay atop it, a symbol of duty, of sacrifice. For those who knew James Hargrove, this wasn't justice. He'd fought through roaring explosions, deadly ambushes, and the howling cold of mountain storms, only to end up here, cold, lifeless, without a final goodbye. His buddies lined the walls. Their faces were drawn tight, hands balled into fists so hard their knuckles went white. Every breath a fight to keep it together. But their eyes, empty, staring, gave away the hurt no metal could fix. In the front pew, a woman with gray streaks in her messy bun gripped a wrinkled photo, her chipped nails digging into it like it might slip away. Clara, James's big sister, looked like a shell of herself, her cries stuck in a throat too torn up to let them loose. But nobody in that dim room felt this loss harder than Scout, the German Shepherd K9, his fur patchy and thin from years of hard fighting. He hunkered down at the chapel doorway, his leash held firmly in the hands of the officer who had brought him. His sides heaved with rough, wheezing breaths, a low rattle slipping out of his scarred snout, like he could feel the gut-wrenching rip of this moment, but was too beat, too gone, to make sense of it. Scout lifted his scarred snout, sniffing the stale air, his cloudy eyes darting around the room, hunting for something, anything, that could explain this. But when those faded brown eyes settled on the coffin, a jolt ran through him. He went still, ears barely twitching, locked on James's lifeless form like it was all he had left to hold on to. Then out of nowhere, he made his move. With a sudden, desperate pull, Scout broke free from the officer's grip, his old claws scraping the scuffed floorboards as he staggered down the aisle. Every step a fight against his battered body. No one could catch him before he lunged. A sharp gasp ripped through the chapel as Scout crashed beside the coffin, his legs giving out mid-jump. The flag on top fluttered faintly from the breeze of his fall, and for a split second, some swore they saw James's chest twitch. Scout scrambled up, pressing his thin frame against the coffin's side, nosing at the wood like he could still smell his soldier inside. A ragged, broken whine slipped out of him, low and gut-wrenching, soaked in loss and confusion. Then he slumped down, resting his graying muzzle against the coffin's edge, eyes half shut. That's when it hit, something heavy, something raw, that stopped every heart in the room cold. What came next left no one untouched, tears streaking down weathered faces. It wasn't over yet. If this story gets to you, help me hit 1,000 subscribers. Leave a like and subscribe now to be part of this milestone. The chapel stayed thick with a silence that squeezed your lungs, the kind that made breathing feel like a chore. Scout huddled against the coffin, his muzzle still pressed to the wood as if begging James to come back. His frail body shook now and then, ears flicking at the soft whimpers echoing around him. He'd been trained to face bullets, bombs and chaos, but this emptiness, nothing in his hard life had readied him for it. His partner, his anchor, his everything was gone, and he was too worn out, too broken to figure out why. A choked sob cut through the stillness. Clara, James's sister, gripped the edge of the pew as though it was the only thing holding her upright. Her face was pale, eyes puffy and raw from crying all night. Around her, the soldiers slumped in their seats, no longer stiff and proper. Their uniforms were crisp, their hands clasped tightly together. They'd stood with James through the worst, seen him claw his way out of fire and blood. But nothing could have braced them for Scout, pressed up against the coffin's side, too broken to let go. A young recruit edged forward, nervous, reaching for Scout's worn-out collar. But the dog let out a low, shaky growl. It wasn't aggressive. It was protective, desperate, like he was begging them to stop. His frail paws scrabbled at the coffin's wood, claws scraping as he tried to hold on to the last piece of James he had left. The officer hesitated, then slowly pulled his hand back. No one in the room had the heart to force Scout away. "Let him stay," Chaplain Reynolds said softly. His voice, though calm, carried the weight of finality. "He's hurting, same as us." Clara swiped at her tears with trembling hands, her whisper barely audible over the silence. "He doesn't get it. He's waiting for James to wake up." Her words sank into the air, thick and suffocating. Scout gave a weak, pitiful whine and bumped his gray muzzle against the coffin, just like he used to do on the battlefield when his handler had been knocked down. "Come on, soldier." But the silence stayed, cold and unyielding. Then all of a sudden, Scout's frail body went rigid. His ears pricked up. His wheezy breaths turned quick and thin. His head jerked up a bit, those cloudy brown eyes zeroing in on something far off, something nobody else could spot. A chill ran through the room, almost imperceptible, but enough to make the hairs on the back of Clara's neck stand up. Scout wasn't just staring, he was locked on, like he was chasing a ghost. Clara swallowed a lump in her throat, shooting a quick look at the chaplain before turning back to Scout. "What's out there, boy?" she whispered, her voice shaky and small. But Scout didn't budge, didn't even blink, just kept his gaze fixed, lost in something she couldn't touch. A dead quiet dropped over the chapel like a heavy blanket. Scout didn't move a muscle, his old frame taut, ears straining forward. Those worn-out eyes stayed glued to whatever he saw, something beyond the rest of them. The air got thick. Grief still hung there, sure, but now there was something else, something creepy you couldn't name. Clara scrubbed at her wet cheeks and tried to follow where he was looking, but there was nothing there, just the casket, the flag, the flickering candlelight. Her heart started pounding. The soldiers swapped nervous looks. This wasn't normal. Scout was highly trained. He wouldn't react like this unless there was something there. Sergeant Dylan Carter, who'd been through the worst with James overseas, coughed rough into the silence. "What's he seeing?" His voice came out scratchy, edged with something between fear and reverence. Nobody had an answer. The quiet dragged on, heavy and tight. Scout didn't even twitch. His breathing stayed slow, deliberate, like he was tuned into something nobody else could pick up. Then out of the blue, he let out a soft, shaky whimper. Not that heartbroken howl from before, but something quieter, almost like he was asking a question. His scruffy tail gave a weak little twitch. He lifted his head an inch higher, his ears twitching as though listening for something faint and distant. And then he relaxed, not fully, but enough for those closest to him to notice. Clara's chest squeezed tight. "Scout," she breathed, inching closer, her boots scuffing the floor. But he didn't even flinch her way. It was as if, for a moment, he wasn't here. He was somewhere else entirely. A place where sorrow didn't weigh so heavily. A place beyond this room, beyond the funeral, beyond death itself. The chaplain sucked in a quick breath, his knuckles whitening around the beat-up Bible in his hands. His face stayed blank. His expression was unreadable, but his fingers trembled slightly. "Sometimes," he muttered, barely loud enough to hear, "dogs see what we cannot." That hit the room like a cold snap. A couple soldiers squirmed in their seats uneasy. Others just stared at Scout, caught between wondering and flat-out dreading what he might have found. Then, just as quick as it came, Scout blinked hard and let out a long, shaky breath. His old body sagged, the tension draining out of him. His scruffy tail flopped limp by his side. He turned his head slow, giving James's coffin one last look before dropping his gray muzzle back against the wood. The room stayed dead quiet, like everyone was holding their breath for something more. But nothing happened. Clara let out a wobbly sigh and edged closer. Hesitant, she reached out, brushing her shaky fingers through Scout's patchy fur. He didn't flinch. He didn't resist. Whatever he had seen, if he had seen anything at all, was gone now. But the feeling in the chapel, that strange, indescribable shift in the air, lingered, and no one dared to speak of it. The silence in the chapel pressed down like a weight nobody could shake. No one said a word. No one budged. Even the air felt different, thicker, charged with something unseen. Scout stayed put, his thin frame slumped against the coffin. His breath came slow and rough, each one rattling in his chest. It was like all that grief had finally crashed down on him, pinning him there. Clara dropped to her knees beside the coffin. Her fingers were still tangled in Scout's fur. Her hands shook bad, her breathing all over the place. She'd spent days trying to wrap her head around James being gone. But now, seeing Scout like this, feeling his hurt, it was like her brother slipped away all over again. She wanted to say it'd be all right, but the words stuck, choking her up. How could she lie when she didn't even believe it herself? Sergeant Carter coughed, his voice coming out tight and gravelly. "I've never seen Scout like this." His eyes darted from the dog to the coffin, doubt clouding his face. The other guys nodded, quiet as stones. They'd watched Scout in the thick of it, tough as nails, sharp, unbreakable. But now, he looked beat, hollowed out. It hit them hard, a punch they didn't see coming. The chaplain shifted in his seat, uneasy. "Dogs don't feel loss like us," he mumbled, half to himself. "But they get it deep down." His hands gripped that worn Bible tighter, knuckles popping white. "Sometimes they hang on longer than we ever could." His words faded out, his face blank but troubled. Then Scout stirred, slow, like it took everything he had. He lifted his head, staring at the coffin's edge where James lay out of reach. A faint, cracked whimper slipped out as he bumped his snout against the wood. Same spot he'd always nudged James's jaw to wake him up. Everything went still for a beat. Then with a shaky push, he hauled himself up to sit. His ears perked, just barely, his posture stiffening. It wasn't much, but you couldn't miss it. Like he was waiting, listening for one last order, one last call to tell him it was okay to stand down. Clara's breath hitched in her throat. She turned toward the chaplain, her voice barely a wispy. "Is he—" She couldn't get the rest out, but the chaplain got it. He let out a slow, heavy breath, his eyes softening as they settled on Scout. Then, in a voice low and firm, he spoke the words nobody else could muster. "Stand down, soldier." Scout's ears twitched, just once. His cloudy gaze stayed glued to the coffin's edge for what felt like forever. A brutal, dragged-out second. Then his shaky frame loosened up. His scruffy tail drooped a little more. His wheezing breaths evened out. It was like that one command finally cut the strings, holding him together. Clara swiped at her eyes, choking back a sob that wouldn't stay down. The soldier stayed quiet, eyes locked on Scout as he eased his gray muzzle back against the coffin's side one last time. This wasn't him waiting for James to snap out of it anymore. It was him letting go. The air in the chapel turned thick, unbearable, pressing down on everyone inside. They all felt it, this gut-deep ache, worse than plain old sadness, heavier than anything they'd carried before. It was that last breath before the end, a stillness that stretched out forever, like the world itself was bowing its head. Scout, who'd been fighting to hold on, finally went slack. His head rested on, his frail body settled, but those worn-out eyes stayed open, staring. Clara slumped beside the coffin, her hands still tangled in Scout's thinning fur. The tears had dried up, not because she was over it, but because she'd run out. She had spent her whole life believing that death was the end. Someone's gone, and that's the end of the story. But watching Scout, seeing how he wouldn't quit even now, she started wondering if she'd got it wrong. Maybe real love, the kind that doesn't break, didn't just fade out. Maybe it stuck around, digging its heels in against the dark. Sergeant Carter, a few steps off, blew out a sharp breath. He'd watched guys crack in the field, seen them fold under the weight of losing someone. But this was something else. His throat clamped shut as he moved in, resting a rough hand on Scout's bony back. The dog didn't budge, just kept breathing slow and deep, like he was soaking up every last bit of James he could hold on to. The chaplain, his voice steady despite the emotions in his eyes, spoke softly. "Scout's job was to protect James," he murmured, "and now he's making sure he gets home safely." Clara bit her lip, nodding, but her heart clenched at the truth in those words. Scout had been at James's side through war, through danger, through every impossible moment, and now he refused to leave him, even in death. The officer who had brought Scout hesitated, then took a deep breath. Slowly, gently, he reached for the dog's collar. "Come on, buddy," he whispered. "It's time." For a moment it seemed Scout wouldn't move. He stayed there, pressed against James, his body frozen, as if he could somehow hold on just a little longer. Then, as if sensing the inevitable, he let out a slow, deep sigh. His ears twitched. His tail gave a weak flick. And finally, he shifted. Clara felt her breath hitch as Scout lifted his head. His eyes lingered on James's face, searching, remembering. The movement was slow, reluctant. The chapel was silent as Scout stepped down from the casket. Soldiers straightened their backs. Clara pressed a shaking hand to her lips. Even the chaplain lowered his head, whispering a quiet prayer. Scout sat at the foot of the casket. His posture was still proud, still strong, but there was something different now. He wasn't waiting anymore. He wasn't searching. He was simply there, honoring the man who had been his partner, his protector, his everything. And just like that, the moment everyone had been dreading had arrived. The funeral had to begin. The chaplain cleared his throat and stepped up, his voice solid but rough around the edges with feeling. Today we gather not only to honor Sergeant James Hargrove's service, but to remember the man he was. Brave, loyal, and above all, selfless. He paused, glancing at the folded flag atop the casket. He gave his life for others, not because he had to, but because he chose to. The soldiers in attendance remained rigid, their discipline unwavering, but their faces told a different story. Their eyes shone with unshed tears, their jaws clenched tightly. They had fought beside James. They had seen him risk everything without hesitation, and now they had to say goodbye. Then came the heavy thud of boots on the scuffed floor, ringing out sharp. The honor guard moved in, steps tight and measured. They reached for the flag on James's coffin, hands steady but slow, like they were handling something that might break. The crisp folds, the silent precision. It was old hat for them, done 100 times. But this one hit different. He wasn't just some name on a list. He was theirs. As they lifted the flag, Scout let out a faint, cracked whine. Soft, but it shook the room like a shout. Clara sucked in a quick, hard breath, her fingers clawing into her dress. He got it. He knew. A soldier dropped to one knee in front of Clara, the folded flag cradled in his gloved hands. His voice came out, steady but soft. "On behalf of the President of the United States Army, and a grateful nation, please accept this flag as a symbol of our appreciation for your loved one's honorable and faithful service." Clara reached out, hands shaking like leaves, and pulled it tight against her chest. It wasn't heavy in pounds, but in what it meant. Everything. A last piece of him. A last goodbye. Then the first crack split the air. The 21-gun salute tore through the quiet, each shot slamming like a pulse you couldn't shake. Out front, the soldiers fired tight and clean, locked in step, faces blank as stone. Clara jumped a little with every bang, nerves shot. But Scout, he didn't twitch. He sat there, still as a statue, cloudy eyes stuck on the coffin, ears barely up. No flinch, no whine. He simply watched, as if standing guard one last time. Then came the sound that broke everyone, a lone, lonesome note. The bugler lifted his trumpet, pressing it against his lips, and began to play taps. It drifted through the chapel, slow and heavy, every note digging into their chests like a dull blade. Scout's head sagged. That stiff, worn-out frame of his seemed to crumple as the tune hit its last, aching stretch. The last sound faded into silence, and right then, Scout did something nobody saw coming. He lay down beside the casket, pressing his body close to where James rested, and let out a deep, heavy sigh. Not of sadness, but of acceptance. The last hum of taps dissolved into the chilly air, leaving a quiet so thick it choked you. Nobody moved a muscle, nobody said a word. Even the wind outside went dead, as if the entire world had paused to mourn the loss of Sergeant James Hargrove. Scout stayed put, stretched out by the coffin, his thin body hugging it like he could keep James close. His breathing settled, steadier now, but those faded eyes carried a far-off hurt. He'd been drilled to fight, to guard, to stick by his guy no matter what. But now, no orders, no job, just a big empty nothing staring him down. Clara hunched there, the folded flag mashed against her chest. It still had a faint warmth from the soldier who'd handed it over, but that was slipping away fast. Her shaky fingers ran over the tight folds, throat closing up as it all sank in. James was gone, really gone. There was no waking up from this, no phone call, no letters from deployment. Just this flag, this funeral, and the unbearable absence of her brother. Sergeant Carter stepped up, his usual steady growl cracking with hurt. "We ought to get Scout out of here," he muttered, flicking a look at the chaplain. "It's wrapping up." Out front, the funeral crew was lined up, ready to roll. Soldiers stood sharp in their ranks, their faces stoic, hands locked behind them like statues. The hearse sat there, shiny under the fading afternoon light, set to take James to his last stop. It was go time. Everything kept moving. But Scout, he was stuck, rooted at the doorway. The sun dipped low, throwing long shadows over the graveyard. The folded flag in Clara's grip got heavier with every step, like James's absence was sinking right into her. The honor guard stood quiet and stiff, a grim nod to the duty and sacrifice that dragged them all out here. Scout trudged beside her, steps sluggish but steady. He'd trailed James through hellholes, through madness, through every close call, and now he was tailing him one last time. They set the coffin down clean over the open grave. The chaplain stepped up, voice holding firm, even with the hurt weighing it down. Sergeant James Hargrove gave his all, to his country, his buddies, and that unbreakable tie with his K-9 partner. He flicked a look at Scout, his face easing up a bit. That tie's still here, even now. The cemetery dropped into a hush so deep it hurt. Soldiers who'd held it together started swiping at their eyes, hands unsteady. Clara clamped her lips tight, fighting to keep it in, her chest heaving with every shaky breath. Carter turned his head a bit, sucking in a rough gulp like he couldn't get air. Even the chaplain froze, letting the moment hang heavy, like it deserved every second of silence. Scout stood there a long beat, then with a weak, trembling push, lifted his scarred paw and set it soft on the coffin's edge. Not a goodbye, but a vow to stick with James forever. That quiet, shaky move choked them all, throats knotted, tears burning. Then, as the last note of taps faded into the cold, Scout's bony frame gave out. He crumpled beside the coffin, thin side pressed hard against the wood, and let out a final, raspy wheeze, his breath quitting in a sharp gust of wind. The funeral turned into a double stab, a goodbye too brutal to take. Clara let out a raw, jagged scream, throwing herself down to wrap her arms around Scout's limp body. The folded flag slipped from her grip, hitting the dirt, tangling with dust and her streaming tears, her world crashing down, nothing left to cling to. A few soldiers lingered, their faces pale as they watched Clara cradle Scout. Carter stepped up, voice cracked and low. "He ain't leaving James, not even now." He nodded to the honor guard, and they moved slow, almost reluctant, digging a small patch right beside James's grave. The earth parted easy under their shovels, like it knew Scout belonged there. They laid him down gentle, his scarred body curled close to the coffin's shadow. Clara knelt there, hands shaking as she smoothed his fur one last time, whispering, "Stay with him, boy." A couple guys tossed dirt over, soft thuds marking the end, but it didn't feel like losing him. It felt right, like they'd never be apart. But as she sat there, the wind howling through the trees, she felt it again. A fleeting warmth, a glimmer of something close, a quiet send-off, or maybe a promise they'd meet again. Some ties don't give out. Scout's grit and James's guts would stick around, buried side by side, no question. Some ties don't give out. If their story moves you, drop a like to honor them. Subscribe for more tales of grit and heart and share your thoughts. Ever seen a bond this tough?